Colossians chapter 3, reading from verse 12 to 17. So the slide, you'll have to jump on a bit to verse 12. There we go. Brilliant. Well done.
Right. Therefore, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other. Just as the Lord has forgiven you, so you must also forgive. Above all, clothe yourself with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. Teach and admonish one another in all wisdom, and with gratitude in your hearts, sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs to God. And whatever you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him.
Thanks ever so much. Neil.
Good morning. It's great to have you with us this morning. Thank you for joining us for worship. So this morning we, as Andy said, are carrying on our sermon series thinking about our Baptist history, Baptist basics, thinking about our DNA. What is it that makes the Baptist Church distinctive? What's our distinct contribution to the church around the world? Now, last time I preached was a few weeks ago, and I did quite a section on history. And a number of you came up to me afterwards and said you really enjoyed that. So I'm kind of hoping that's true, because we're going to go there again. And I enjoyed preparing and learning for this. So I found it interesting. I kind of hope you do. If you don't, find Tetris on your phone or something and tune back in next week when normal service will be resumed. But we're going to go there again. So just to remind you a little bit about where the Baptist Church comes from. The Baptist Church was definitely a child of the Reformation. In fact, of the post-Reformation denominations, the Baptists are the largest single denomination worldwide. And we have our roots in the 17th century. So just to recap something of what I shared last week, the 17th century begins with James I on the throne. Yes, that is King James of the King James Bible, the authorized version, the version that he authorized for worship. Now, James was the first king of both England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. And he needed to find a way, find the authority with which to rule this new expanded kingdom. And James found that in what's known as the divine right of kings. This idea that he'd been divinely appointed to rule over this nation, and therefore his authority came from the church. And James looked to bolster that authority. And he did so by installing the Church of England as the state church. No other worship outside the Church of England was allowed. You couldn't gather in meetings of over 5 people outside of a Church of England meeting. Well, there were those that dissented, and that's where the name comes from. The dissenters from this idea. 2 of those, particularly relevant to the Baptist story, are a lawyer called Thomas Helvis, who studied at Gray's Inn in London, and an Anglican clergyman called John Smythe. And they became convinced together that actually the king should have no right of say over the religious conscience of individuals. We should be able to determine our own religious choices. So they met illegally with a group of 40 others in Gainsborough for a meeting outside of the church. Well, to say James I was nonplussed about this is an understatement. He used the force of the law and the force of the army to clamp down on these illegal church meetings. So much so that Helvis and Smythe would eventually, with their entire congregation, flee to Amsterdam, where religious freedom and toleration was more acceptable. While there, they came into contact with the Mennonites, the Anabaptist Mennonites, where they heard about this idea of believers' baptism. And they became convinced that this is how they should practice their faith. So with their fledgling congregation in Amsterdam, Smythe baptized himself first, and then he went on to baptize Helvis and the rest of their congregation. And the first English-speaking Baptist church in the world that owned that name was formed in Amsterdam in exile. Well, as happened in those early days, they fell out, basically, within a couple of years. And Helvis decided he would return to England, where he set up the first Baptist church on English soil in Spitalfields, just at that time outside the walls of London. As he did so, he wrote a short book on the iniquity of faith, about freedom of religion, about freedom of conscience of religion. For those of you that haven't heard this, that missed my sermon a few weeks ago, it's one of the founding documents of the Declaration of Human Rights. He wrote that, arguing for religious toleration and independence. He signed a copy and sent it to the king. Provocative, you might say. The king responded, locked him up, threw him in prison, and English prisons of that period were notoriously rough, and he died in prison. That is where we left our story last time. Well, James I dies, and his second son takes over the throne. His first son, Henry, has also passed away as a young boy. So James I becomes king of England. And Charles I becomes king of England. And he's very much in the mold of his father. He is asserting his royal prerogative to do what he wants as king of England. And he spends basically, his reign is characterized by consistent quarreling with Parliament. Parliament has been largely infiltrated by some of these separatists, these nonconformists known as Puritans. And Parliament has a real Puritan flavour at this point. And the king is going around asserting his right to do what he wants, and he's described by many as a bit of a tyrant. One thing he does, for example, is he imposes his own tax independently of Parliament, a tax that should be paid directly to him, that he should be able to do with to support his army and do what he wants. Well, this quarrelling goes on and it escalates, and it doesn't end well. As you probably know from history in school, King Charles I is the king who's on the throne at the beginning of the English Civil War. We should actually probably say the English Civil Wars, plural, because it was actually 3 wars that were kind of going on at the same time. The first group to get naffed off with Charles I were the Scots. It's always the Scots. Sorry, Ian. But they were completely fed up with his assertion, this English king asserting his authority over them. So they rallied an army and started to invade from the north. Buoyed up by the Scottish, the Irish decided they'd had enough as well. So they got stuck in with an army from the west. Well, with these two going on, Parliament decided now was their chance. The parliamentarians, they decided they were going to join in the conflict. Now, you may have heard of the New Model Army under Oliver Cromwell, the English Civil War. I thought New Model Army were just a band from the 1980s. But it turns out they're not. It was based on something. Oliver Cromwell's army. What's interesting from a Baptist point of view is that Baptists were very involved in the New Model Army. Particularly Baptist pastors, who it is said found fertile ground around the soldiers' fires at night for converts to this new Baptist faith. And actually, the English Civil War was a very rapid time of expansion for the Baptist church. Well, Charles I ends up losing the Civil War, and he knows it, so he decides he's Scottish, he's from the House of Stuart, he's going to flee back north and appeal with the Scots to see if they will give him sanctuary and help him against the English. The first thing he does when he gets to Scotland is the Scots clap him in irons and send him back to London. They're having none of it. So he arrives back in London to face trial for treason. Now, as he points out in his defence, treason is an offence against the king. How can the king be tried for treason? It makes no sense. Parliament dismisses his claim and certainly decides that he should be executed. One fact that I came across this week: over 50% of the signatories to the execution of Charles I were Baptists. I'm not sure if that's a high point or a low point in our historical story, but it certainly illustrates that Baptists were not afraid of challenging political power and challenging it in the most forthright of ways. Charles is executed, and following a couple of years, Oliver Cromwell is proclaimed Lord Protector of the newly formed Commonwealth of England. The monarchy has been deposed. He is now leading from Parliament. Now, it appears, from what I was able to discover this week, that Oliver Cromwell was not a bunch of fun. He was not a fun character. In fact, the primary source of my research this week has been watching episodes of Horrible Histories, which I have to say is utter genius. What a fantastic program. I'm dropping Netflix. Next week, me and my family are going to sit down and review old episodes of Horrible Histories. They're just brilliant. And I thought, just in case today... Now, Andrew, sorry I didn't warn you. You're going to need to mute the stream for this one. And Jamie, find a wide shot. We do have permission, by the way, to show BBC clips. We pay for a license to do so. But YouTube don't know that, and they'll cut us off. But the BBC give us permission. So I thought, as a bit of light relief, in case we were all getting a bit too heavy, I'd give you 2 minutes of Horrible Histories on why Oliver Cromwell was not a bunch of fun. So there you are, a small bit of light relief in the middle. Oliver Cromwell, it turns out, was not a bunch of fun. Yes, he did ban Christmas, he banned all sport, he banned all theatre, he banned makeup, and he banned pubs. Well, life under Oliver Cromwell was not a great deal of fun. And when he died, in a strange phenomenon, sort of almost like a kingly succession, his son Richard took over the leadership of Parliament. Richard, it turns out, was not the statesman, hadn't the power or the authority of his father, and it soon struggled. And Parliament decided, actually, in hindsight, they'd been better off with a king after all. So you get what's called the restoration of the monarchy. So they write to Charles II, Charles I's son, who's been living in exile in France. And they invite him back to take on the throne of, first of all, Scotland and then England, on one condition: that he agrees to establish the church as a presbytery, as the Presbyterian church, which means that he will give power to the clergy, to the bishops. They will have authority to lead the church. He'll become a notional figurehead of the church, but he should give authority to the bishops. Well, interestingly, while he's been in France all these years, he's developed quite a Catholic sensibility, and the English are still very suspicious of the Catholics. And he's characterized by a very high form of Anglicanism. In particularly, in 1662, he passed a law called the Act of Conformity. He'd released the 1662 prayer book. Thomas Cranmer had written this new prayer book, And the insistence was that every church should use this prayer book and they should conform to this. It was fairly Anglo-Catholic style of worship. 2,000 Anglican priests rebelled and refused to use this new prayer book. That was 1/5 of the Anglican clergy. You can't quite see it on the screen, but this is a book of a number of their published sermons as they left the church. They refused to conform. That's where we get nonconformists from. The act of conformity was that they should all use the 1662 prayer book, and they refused to conform to it, becoming nonconformists. Just out of interest, you may or not, sorry, I look like I'm boring you now. We'll get on in a minute, I promise. On sabbatical a couple of years ago, I decided to visit other churches. And I went to Chevening, and I went to their early morning communion service. Chris Smith was there at the time. And once a month in their early morning communion service, they still do a sung Eucharist from the 1662 book. It kind of holds this romanticism within a certain section of particularly the Anglican population. It's kind of, people argue about the language of the King James Bible. Well, it's also the language of this prayer book. It's held up as a romantic kind of picture of worship. Well, moving on, and I am getting to the point now, I promise. So Charles II dies, leaving no heir. So his next living relative is his brother, who remains in exile in France. James II is invited to come back and take the throne. As you can see on there, it only lasts 3 years. James II has basically become Catholic while he's in France. And as he returns to England with his daughter Mary, he basically is too Catholic for the parliamentarians. And two things happen in 1688. One, he has a son, James. Parliament becomes very concerned that this is going to lead to a Catholic succession. And secondly, he tries to pass a bill to reinstall Catholic worship in the UK. Well, this is enough for Parliament, so they contact his daughter Mary, who's a Protestant, and suggest that her and her husband, William of Orange, should take the throne instead. They assemble an army and they march on Oxford, where James II is to be found, in order to take the throne. James gives up, decides he's not going to have a battle. He liked it in France better anyway. So he's going to pop back to France, and William and Mary take over the English throne. The only reason I finish with them in our story is they come to the throne in 1688, and in 1699, the first act they passed is a thing called the Act of Toleration. The Act of Toleration enabled Baptists to worship freely in England for the first time. It allowed nonconformists to worship and gather without the threat of sanction from the state. So from the end of the 17th century, Baptists are now free to worship in the UK, and they begin to explode in numbers. Here ends the history lesson. I don't know if you found it interesting or not. I kind of did, but I hope you did. If you didn't, we'll be back to normal next week. Andy was very helpful earlier. He suggested I edit my sermon. So on my way past those slides, which we'll deal with next week, I just want to mention that we have Josh Hunt, who's our regional minister. Baptist churches have always gathered in associations across regions. They've done it all through their lives in different groups. And we are part of an association known as the South Eastern Baptist Association. And we have a regional minister, kind of like a bishop without the power, because the power is here with the congregation. But he's a respected individual with oversight over churches. And Joth is actually going to be preaching here next week for us, wrapping this series up for us. So it'll be a great chance for you to meet him. So skipping over that lot, which, to be honest, was boring me, perhaps, so I've saved you. I'm going to come to 3 observations, I think, from the history of the Baptist Church. Before I do that, the first is to say that I'm very glad that anti-Catholic sentiment is behind us, aren't you? I know I've talked a lot about the 17th century, and there was obviously, there's a big part of our history that we can't ignore. But actually, as many of you know, I'm studying at Durham, where there's the Centre for Catholic Studies. A good number of the people on my course are Catholics, and it's been a delight to get to know them and learn from them. And people who hold a faith that looks and feels a bit different to mine, but hold it with great integrity. And it's been fantastic to learn from them. So I'm really glad that one conflict is behind us. But 3 observations about Baptists. The first is we were born in dissent. Baptists have always been, in some shape or form, a protest movement. What might that look like today? Secondly, that Baptists are absolutely children of the Reformation. The Bible is central to our worship, and I'm going to talk a bit about that. And finally, I think our great gift to the world at this moment in time is our ability to find unity in diversity. Let me deal with those 3 things very quickly. As you have heard, as I've painted the picture of the 17th century, Baptists were born in protest and in dissent. But it was never in dissent for its own sake. It was because of the way they read the Bible, particularly the declaration and claim that Jesus is Lord. Because if you were to declare Jesus is Lord, then implicit you were implying that Caesar is not. And Baptists have always had that at the heart of their declaration, that we are citizens of a different kingdom, that we serve a different king. We will participate in the state when it's working for the common good, but we will not be afraid to challenge it when it is not. Because our allegiance is to Jesus. To say Jesus is Lord is to say that Caesar is not. And Baptists have never been afraid of protest when it's been called for. Secondly, we are absolutely children of the Reformation. Children of the book. The Reformation cry of sola scriptura, scripture alone. That this is the heart and center of our worship. That this is how God speaks. That we gather around this book. The centrality of the Bible. And you can see that even in the architecture of many Baptist churches. Think of Anglican churches. The centerpiece is the altar, Eucharist. In Baptist churches, particularly the traditional ones, I know we're a little bit different here, but the centerpiece is the pulpit. Because the preaching and teaching of the Bible is what Baptists have always held important and dear. This idea that this story shapes our story. That in the story of Jesus, we find hope and we ourselves are changed and reformed and reshaped in order to live in the world. Now, what I want to suggest to you is that it's not only solely an intellectual idea. It is not just about getting all your intellectual and theological ducks in a row. Because as Andy pointed out this week on Facebook, my ducks are absolutely not in a row. I don't even know where some of them are, and I'm quite certain one of them is a pigeon. Which is a humorous way of saying that we need to not make it all about intellectual argument and proposition. That's important and it's fascinating, but part of practicing humility is recognizing that we might be wrong. And that actually, I know over my faith journey, I have changed my views on a number of things a number of times. In fact, I think it looks a little bit more like this. That a good way to hold the Bible central to our teaching and preaching is to think about it, to shape our theology, but then allow that to inform our action in the world. To go and practice it. And then as we practice, everybody knows that actions shape our thinking. It's not the other way around often. So we allow that then to come back round, our engagement to bring us back to the Bible, to study again, and we embark on this reflective cycle where we grow. There may be ideas that you have held intellectually and theologically dear from childhood. It is possible that you can change your mind when you start to live them out in the world. And what I want to say to you is that's okay. In fact, that's natural. I think that's a healthy process of growth, as long as we hold Christ at the centre. And for particularly the earliest Baptists, the stories of Jesus, the four Gospels, but particularly the Sermon on the Mount, was a real linchpin of how they thought about the world. And the last Baptist distinctive I think we can draw from our Baptist heritage, which is a gift to the world at this moment, is unity in diversity. And friends, that is where our reading came up today. This is why I chose to read from Colossians 3 today. Bear with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other, just as the Lord has forgiven you, so you must also forgive. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony, and let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. Baptists have always thought differently. That's a distinctive. If you give people religious freedom and tell them you're not going to tell them what to believe from the top, you end up with people reading the scriptures and coming to a variety of different opinions. That has strengths and it has weaknesses. And we need checks and we need balances. But we do that together. That's where the check. We're not isolated individuals. We're part of a community. We learn. We hold one another accountable. Associations hold churches accountable. And we begin to think about what our faith looks like. And the gift I think the Baptist Church has to the world at the moment is we've always disagreed. But that's not what has divided us. What unites us is this meal. It's Christ in the center. It's baptism, it is communion. Those are the things that unite us, and they supersede intellectual ideas and differences. In fact, we grow, we wrestle, we disagree, we have conversation, we debate. Sometimes robustly. And then we love one another and we return to the table and we share communion and we say, but that we will not allow to divide us because we are one body. That is a distinctive way of being Baptist in the world. In fact, a few years ago, the five top Baptist theologians from the Baptist colleges and in the country posted a paper. You can read it on the Baptist Union website. It's called The Courage to be Baptist. And it's a call to that unity and diversity in the world. Because we all know the church is busy tearing itself apart over hot topic issues, don't we? Particularly the issue of same-sex marriage. It's become the hot button issue for our society at the moment. And churches are busy tearing themselves apart. Denominations are talking about splitting. And if we as Baptists have something to offer that conversation, it is to say, you can hold your view with integrity. For some people, it might be out of a homophobic, but for others, it's how they read the Bible, that they hold with real integrity, and I have to respect that. That might be different to how I choose to read it, and I'm asking them to respect me as well. Because Christ didn't die on the cross for us to resolve this issue. So actually the Baptist Church can say we can debate and we can discuss this. But actually we are united around something different. And we find a place where we can hold a diversity of views together and continue in worship. I think that is a gift for the Baptist Church at the moment. For the world at the moment, the Baptist churches have. How we disagree well. Let me wrap it up and bring it down to land because I need to, because you're glazing over and I'm done. What does the future hold? What does our Baptist history prep us for the future? What might protest look like? What might be appropriate things for us to sink our teeth into? Let me suggest to you 3 things. These are just mine. As we know, mine, I don't get to say here. We decide together. But 3 things that I think might be important. One is I do think we need to wrestle with the subject of inclusion. I think the way that the world has moved around us, we have to tackle that subject and we need to talk about it. We need to respect that we have different views, but if we do not, we risk missional obscurity. We risk being left behind and marginalised to a remnant of the past. So we have to be brave at some stage, and we have to have that, and we continue to press for, to my mind, a place where all are welcome and all can find God's love. That's maybe reforming within. Looking out at the political world, I wonder whether now is the time to challenge the arms trade. The weapons industry that sells bombs that kill millions. Pacifism has always been a trait of Baptist churches. If we were to pick a political issue, we see bombs made in English factories raining down in places all over the world. And finally, on harvest, climate. If we're to care for God's earth, we have to have a strong, robust voice on climate. How we're going to care for this God's creation. They might be my 3 pitches for things that I think. But what we're going to do is on Thursday, I keep wanting to say Friday, on Thursday when the church email comes out, there will be an invitation to a survey in that. A chance for you to give us your thoughts about church. What do we do well? What could we do better? What are the issues that we should be engaging with in the future as a church? And part of this Baptist thing that we're trying to do is to ask you your opinions. So what I would love you to do, and I know surveys aren't the most popular thing in the world, but when you get the email on Friday, grab yourself a cup of tea or coffee, take yourself away for 15 minutes and fill it in for us. Because we'd love to then be able to come back, and in a couple of weeks' time, we can have a conversation about what we found and what that survey revealed and how we as a church might shape our future together. Because it's not just about me, it's about us. Because I believe God is leading us forward, and I believe the Baptist Church has a future. We have a powerful voice to offer the world in these things. We need the confidence to find our voice again and speak. Thank you. You've been very good, very patient. Well, to be honest, it's more of a hostage situation than a sermon, to be honest. Because really, you can't get up and go anywhere. So you were stuck listening to me, whether you liked it or not. But thank you. When you get that survey, do fill it in. Andy?
I guess I've been just thinking what Charlie was saying there about unity and diversity, just looking at social media, all sorts of things, just aware that as a nation, on every issue almost, people want to divide us. Are you for, are you against, extremism, whatever, and we just end up dividing ourselves, and we've forgotten how to disagree well and to discern together. Instead we take sides and we argue, and a community that's committed to working it through together and not writing each other off, not saying they're the enemy because I disagree with them, not saying they're a threat, but simply listening and learning together and holding each other in love. I think our nation needs that at the minute. I think our world needs that at the moment. So thank you, Charlie. Thank you so much.